We start talking about the skeletal system, and we're going to start with skeletal physiology. Two major components of the skeleton are bones and cartilages. We're going to talk about cartilage and its structure first, types of cartilage, and then we're going to talk about the bone and, the bone growth and, all other stuff. So cartilage. It's resilient, structurally resilient tissue, which matrix is not vascularized. The matrix of the cartilage, you can see the cartilage here in that pink substance is the matrix. This substance contains water, and that what provides cartilage that mechanical resilience. Okay, it's not vascularized. Only perichondrium, the layer on the outer surfaces of the cartilage, have blood vessels. Lack of blood vessels in the matrix kind of gives us the idea about two things. First, you can do the cartilage and ligament, that's similar structures. You can do transplantation. You can replace the damaged cartilage with cartilage from, say, another animal. But the problem with the low vascularization is that cartilage heals very slowly, if ever. Question? No, you good? So perichondrium that surrounds cartilage. It's the layer of the dense connective tissue, okay? And it restricts the cartilage in terms of expanding outwards. So if you think about this, think about a water-filled bladder. If you press on the bladder, it starts to expand. Does that make sense? It starts to expand. So that perichondrium prevents cartilage that contains a lot of water to expand. Major cells in the cartilage are called chondrocytes. You can see chondrocytes in the lacunae. This picture of elastic cartilage to your right. Chondrocytes in the lacunae in the picture of the hyaline cartilage to your left. Chondrocytes produce matrix. That same pink substance that we just referred to. There are three major types of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibrous. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant type in the human body. In the picture to your right, picture of the skeleton, hyaline cartilage is represented with a blue color. For instance, hyaline cartilage connects ribs to the sternum. I sometimes call hyaline cartilage jack of all trades, master of none. So it's decently elastic and it's decently solid, mechanically resilient. Okay? It doesn't have the elasticity of elastic cartilage or mechanical resilience of the fibrous cartilage, though. A lot of cartilages that form septa, say nasal cartilage, right here, is also hyaline cartilage. Cartilage that surrounds trachea is hyaline cartilage. Doesn't contain elastic fibers, which restricts its elasticity. It contains only collagen. Elastic cartilage, as you can guess from the name, you can see the picture here, it isn't extremely mechanically resilient, but it possesses a great degree of elasticity. You can find it in three locations in the human body. Both ears, auricle is skin-covered elastic cartilage. And in the epiglottis, structure that closes the larynx and therefore trachea the moment when you swallow. That is why food, when you swallow normally, goes into the esophagus and not in your respiratory passages. The third type of the cartilage is fibrocartilage. It contains a lot of thick collagen fibers, which determines its strength and resilience. Fibrocartilage can be found in the places in the human body which experience great pressure forces. One such place is obviously the vertebral column, okay, which carries the weight of the trunk. So those intervertebral discs on the outside are made of fibrocartilage. That's one place to find fibrocartilage. Another one, meniscus of the knee. Okay, they aren't shown here, but if we would take a look, the knee joint, you can see menisci these structures that increase feet between the condyles of the femur and condyles of the tibia. Menisci fibrocartilage. That explains too, how people can lift enormous weights without crushing the knee joints. And the third place where you can find fibrocartilage is the pubic symphysis. It's the barely movable joint between two pelvic bones, right here. It looks counterintuitive that this joint is protected. This joint contains fibrocartilage because what kind of pressure does it experience? But if you think about the mechanical forces that act on the pelvic bones carry the weight of the trunk, and this weight is projected towards the pubic symphysis. These two bones, they sort of meet in the center and press on that layer of fibrocartilage. Does that make sense? So please know the locations of those three types of cartilage. Know their function, elasticity versus mechanical resilience versus sort of, general function. And please know the fibers that you're going to find. Collagen fibers in fibrocartilage or in hyaline cartilage versus elastic in the elastic cartilage. Clear? Good? Cartilage, of course, can grow, and there are two types of growth: positional and interstitial. In the appositional growth, which is illustrated by this scheme, chondrocytes that are young and located next to the perichondrium add matrix. You can see it is shown in this dark blue layer. They add matrix immediately next to the perichondrium. Think about this as adding layers of cartilage right next to the perichondrium. Okay? So matrix eventually becomes old. So if you think about this, if this is cartilage and it experiences appositional growth, it will become thicker. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, interstitial growth is when chondrocytes deep inside the matrix divide, and as they divide, they produce new matrix, which expands the cartilage from within into all directions. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Go ahead. So what do you mean? Size-wise?
Structurally, what happens during oppositional growth? What type of effect does that have on our bodies?
So, oppositional growth will make cartilage thicker in all dimensions. Do you know what I'm trying to say? So think about this. If I'm the cartilage, and this is perichondrium, and this is perichondrium. If I experience interstitial growth, I will become thicker, thicker, and longer.
Right.
In case of oppositional growth, what's going to happen? I'm going to become thicker. That's it. So in the body, oppositional growth will be observed mostly in the epiphysis of the long bones. So oppositional growth of cartilage, turns out, is responsible for the bone elongation.
Okay.
Interstitial growth is responsible mostly for general thickening of the cartilage, expanding the cartilage.
Okay. That's what I was trying to figure out. Like, what does it do? What's the purpose of it?
That make sense?
Yes.
Good. We clear from this? So know the difference. Again, oppositional growth, adding layers of matrix immediately next to the perichondrium. Interstitial growth, multiplying chondrocytes produce new matrix, and the cartilage grows from within. Another important feature of the cartilage is that it can calcify. Okay? It can become hardened. And that's a necessary step in the process of bone growth. However, we have to be very clear on that. Cartilage doesn't turn into the bone. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay? Cartilage, even if it calcified and it's solid and hard, it is not the bone. We good? Okay. Examples of calcified cartilage in really old people. Sometimes you may see older folks, they have a lot of respiratory infections, respiratory diseases. You know why? Part of the problem is that the cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum, hyaline cartilage here, is calcified. So they cannot expand the chest properly. So the respiratory function declines. Lung ventilation, alveolar ventilation decreases. And that provides, great growth conditions for various types of microbes. Yes? Die young. That's normal. That's normal. And it turns out, a lot of diseases that we talk about now, diseases of the old people, the only reason we see them, because we now live long enough. Okay? Because if you die at the age of 35 because the tiger bites your head off, you're not going to experience Alzheimer's. Okay? So, bones. There are 206 bones in the human skeleton, and by the way, you're going to know all of them. Sounds like a lot of work. Honestly, the time required to memorize all the bones in a human skeleton is about 3 hours. We're not going to do it in this part of the lecture, but just to give an idea. How many ribs? 24. There are ribs. That's it. They're ribs. Just, that's rib and that's rib. You can number them. How many vertebrae? 7, 12, 5. I mean, without sacrum and coccus, it's going to be 5, 12, 17, 24 vertebrae. There's not much to memorize. Lower limbs are paired. Upper limbs are paired. So if you know one humerus, you know 2 humeri. If you know one radius, 2 radii. Does that make sense? So there's really just like easy, seriously. Skeleton is divided into 2 parts. Here in this picture, blue is your axial skeleton. Skull, thoracic cage, vertebral column. Everything else that includes pectoral girdle, upper limbs, pelvic girdle, lower limbs is called appendicular skeleton. Do you understand the difference between axial and appendicular? Which skeleton has more bones?
Oh, no, because of the feet and hands.
Appendicular. Carpal bones, carpal and tarsal bones, there are plenty of them. Yes, it's appendicular. Bones can be classified into 3 types. Long. Long bones are longer and they wide. Is that the long bone? What about these 2? Yes. What about this little guy? It is a long bone. I mean, it's very small, but it's a long bone based on the classification. It's longer and then it's wider. And it turns out all long bones share this similar anatomical structure. If you cut it along, if you do the longitudinal section or cross section, they look very similar. We clear? Short bones. The cube-shaped bones. The most characteristic ones are the carpal bones and the tarsal bones. I'm not bringing Marvin closer to you because Marvin tends to jump on people. Another type of short bones are sesamoid bones. One very characteristic sesamoid bone is patella, the kneecap bone. There are also sesamoid bones. I don't know if you can see it in Marvin. There are tiny, they're called sutural bones as well, sesamoid bones in the skull. Number and shape of those bones varies from person to person. Okay? They don't have any very specific anatomical name, just, sutural bones. Flat bones. Thin, flat, and slightly curved. Pretty obvious flat bones are the bones of the cranium. Another surprisingly flat bones, your ribs. Okay? And we'll see the differences in structure. Because ribs, you can say, wait, how ribs are flat bones? They're long. Turns out the inner anatomical structure of flat bones is very different from anatomical structure of long bones. And ribs have the flat bone structure. And the 4th type, irregular bones. Irregular bones have complicated shapes. Coxal bones. All vertebrae are irregular. Okay. Now you need to be able to, like, I show you the bone, you tell me if it's flat, irregular, short, or long. Okay. Does that make sense? Questions? Functions. Support and movement. If you think about this, that protects and supports your brain, protects key organs, lungs, heart, huge chunk of your liver. Okay, damage to those organs is pretty nasty. Okay, muscles are attached to the bones. so you are able to move. That makes sense? Bones store minerals. I have this table somewhere. Most of the calcium, practically all calcium, all phosphorus is in the bones. So now you have to understand that's a storage. If there's a need in calcium, it will be taken first and foremost from the bones. Good? That makes sense here. Growth factors can be released from the bones. In the red bone marrow, blood cells are formed. In neonates, in little children, red bone marrow can be found in practically every bones. In the adults, it's the ends, the epiphysis of the long bones. Proximal epiphysis of the humerus, for instance, or proximal epiphysis of the femur. Some flat bones have a lot of bone marrow. For instance, skull bones and ribs have bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow stores fat. What is the function of that fat? What is generally the function of the fat? Energy reserves. Okay, so that yellow bone marrow provides the energy reserves. It produces hormone, osteocalcine, which has multiple effects, regulation of formation of the bone, maybe what's the word? Anyway, stimulate insulin production, so may prevent development of diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, may protect against obesity, but probably mentioned my stance on obesity. It's a lifestyle disease. Now, bones, each bone is an organ, so it's a massive system of organs, okay? Bones contain all types of tissues. Of course, they contain connective tissue. Does that make sense? Because bone is the type of connective tissue. It's not connective tissue proper, but still. They contain cartilage. They contain fibrous connective tissue. It's a part of the cartilage. They contain nervous tissue, of course. They innervated. Smooth muscle and epithelium in the blood vessels. So all four types of tissues can be found in a given bone. They are very mechanically strong. The compression resistance is 50% of that compared to steel. Okay? Tension, strongest steel, so you cannot possibly, tear the bone into pieces. On the other hand, they're fragile if you want to break them. That's a different story. Okay? To give you an idea how strong the bones are, have you seen strongman competition? They don't have any problems lifting those enormous weights. Okay? At least from the bone side. Bones can withstand really, really huge weight without being broken. Another important feature of the bones, not that probably it was evolutionary advantages, but so it happens. Since they are mineralized, they remain more or less intact for a long time after death. And they are the great source of forensic information, both in terms of the, criminal misdeeds and in terms of the ancient people. For instance, when there is some sort of famine or the person is diseased, and think about this, if the person is diseased, the person will probably stop growing, okay? Like, I'm 5'9", my dad is about 5'2". He grew up during the World War II. The food was not readily available, so he's not really tall at all, okay? Now, he probably has so-called growth arrest lines in his bones. When person stops growing, you can see on the X-ray the growth arrest lines. That either refers to the famine or lack of food supply or disease. Another thing, if there is any malformation in the bone, it can be recovered later. For example, one of the oldest known cancer patients was digged up from the burial site of ancient people in Chile. That burial site was found in Atacama Desert, which probably helped. It's the driest place on earth. And according to the study of the bones, that was something like, well, it was a girl, I don't remember the age, honestly, but like 7-10-year-old girl with what looks exactly like a bone sarcoma, the bone tumor. She probably died of it. That's the oldest evidence of, tumor in people. Obviously, we had it for a long time. But, okay? Does that make sense? Right? Now, in terms of the anatomy, what does the bone look like? Let me see if I have the bone. Well, I kind of do. No, it's, well, sort of. I don't have a cross-section of the bone. Well, if you will cut the bone, you will see that any bone in the human body consists of two subtypes, compact bone and spongy bone. So this is how a compact bone looks like. It's dense, and it's always on the outside. You can see here, in this picture, the compact bone on the outside of the flat bone. Here, compact bone is on the outside of the long bone. Does that make sense? So pretty much what you see, this gentleman, which is plastic, of course, but what you can see on this gentleman is the compact bone. All those surfaces are the compact bone. Spongy bone, which is also called diploid, or trabecular bone, or cancellous bone. It's the network of lattices and rods, okay? These lattices and rods are called trabeculae. Spongy bone is always deep to compact. Here, this illustration of the flat bone, you can see that spongy bone is pretty much sandwiched between two layers of the compact bone. Right? In this illustration of the structure of the long bone, you again can see that spongy bone, although it accumulates in the bone ends, for instance, this represents humerus, so that would be bone ends. Okay, bone ends are called epiphysis. Okay, it accumulates in epiphysis. It is still deep to the compact bone. So far, do you follow me? Now, every layer of compact bone, all this compact bone, this whole thing, like the whole skeleton, every surface of the compact bone is by default covered by the connective tissue membrane called periosteum. It's a tough, resilient, fibrous connective tissue. Okay? On the inside here, in the inside of the long bone, these surfaces, as well as the surfaces of trabecular bones, they are covered by endosteum. Endosteum is thin and delicate connective tissue. Does that make sense? So let's recall what we learned. Compact bone is on the outside of any bone. If it's flat, short, or irregular bone inside, the inside is going to be filled by trabecular bone or spongy. If it's a long bone, it's going to have a cavity inside. But in the epiphysis of the long bone, you're going to find spongy bone as well. Bones on the outside are covered by periosteum, and the surface of trabecular bones, or the inner surface of the cavity in the long bone, is covered by endosteum. Okay? In the spongy bones, in the flat, short, or irregular bones, the space in the between the trabeculae, can you see that? This structure has a lot of empty spaces. Can you see that? All those empty spaces in the trabecular bone will be filled with the bone marrow. In the long bones, bone marrow will be found either in the medullary cavity or filling up spaces in a spongy bone in the epiphysis. No, both, of course, both. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it's going to be in both. Red bone marrow will be in the epiphysis. Yellow bone marrow will be in the cavity. Okay? Don't think that the bone is like empty inside. It's not. Okay? Does that make sense? So if you think about the structure of the flat bone or short bone or irregular bone, you can think of it as a sandwich. Compact bone, spongy in between. Spongy bone is filled with bone marrow. Periosteum on the inside, lattices of spongy bone are covered with endosteum. If you take long bone and do the cross section, what you're going to see is epiphysis. So this epiphysis is going to be proximal. This epiphysis is going to be distal. Do you understand why this is proximal and this is distal? Remember anatomical terminology? It's closer to the trunk. This part of the bone is called diaphysis. The shaft of the bone is diaphysis. Okay? In the diaphysis, you're going to find the medullary cavity, which is usually in the adults. It is filled with yellow bone marrow. Outside of the bone is covered with periosteum, inside with endosteum. If the bone and long bones articulate with each other, now the new word for you may be articulation. When two bones form a joint, when they contact with each other, they articulate. Your mandible articulates with temporal bone. Temporal bone articulates with the parietal bone. They are in touch. Ribs articulate with sternum. Does that make sense? But let's say parietal bone doesn't articulate with the first cervical vertebrae. They're not in touch. Is that understood? Articulation is when two bones touch each other, form a joint. Even if the joint is completely immovable, like this joint here, this suture, okay, the coronal suture between the frontal bone and parietal bones, coronal suture is the immovable joint. Are we clear? But it's still articulation. So, on the long bones, articulating surfaces are covered with cartilage. If you would look at this example of this knee right here, you see the distal end of the femur. Can you see that white coverage of the condyles? This is hyaline cartilage. Okay, it covers the ends, improving the gliding and, reducing the friction. Now, here in the epiphysis, you can see the growth plate. Can you see this line over here? In kids, it's called epiphyseal growth plate. In adults, it's epiphyseal growth line. This structure in the bone is responsible for the bone elongation. When we become older, say 20, 25, this line turns, it's a cartilage technically. It's not technically, it's a cartilage in kids. When this cartilage is converted, replaced by the bone, we stop growing. But this line reminds us of the time when we grew. Okay? We're going to wrap it up. I'm going to meet you on Thursday, and we'll keep